now going to turn to Ken Doctor. Since we're talking about local and regional news, we wanted to get a snapshot of a local regional community. And Ken Doctor is intimately familiar with the Twin Cities. He used to be the managing editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press during his 21 years with Knight Ridder. And Ken Doctor is now a media analyst with Outsell, and he's here to talk about our region and what it says about strengths and weaknesses in local markets.
Thank you very much. I think you're going to see a theme morning, but we are going to move on to regional here. You recognize some of those faces there, I imagine. The new local, how will we get there from here is where I'm going with this. We've had, as we've talked about this morning, a journalistic big bang. And this is both for readers and for advertisers. Now, if you look at, this is the year when I left the Twin Cities, which I can't believe is 12 years ago. So 12 years ago, these are the brands. When we would have the meetings over there a few blocks away at the Pioneer Press on the executive committee, and we talk about next year, and the advertising people would say, we're going up 3 to 5% in advertising pricing, and the circulation people would say, we're going to be flat to 1% up, depending on how much sales pressure money you want to give us. And I would say to the editor, Walker Lundy, at that point, how does that work? How does that work? You keep on increasing advertising pricing and circulation pricing, and circulation keeps on being flat. And he said, don't worry, it'll work until I retire. It actually did. It actually did. But this was the world. You kind of looked at the world, and really, we only cared about the Star Tribune at the Pioneer Press. And the way we dealt with that is we sent home builders, realtors, car dealers on golfing trips to Scotland to get a little more than our market share. Sorry, Joel, at that point. It worked for a long time. And we had these brands here, and you can see them. I found an older KSTP logo. I noticed KSTP no longer calls itself KSTP when I got back to town. Oops, excuse me. So here, now I didn't fit on to all this slide everybody that's in the competition, but this is the competition for readers and advertisers in a nutshell. And this is in 12 years' time. So you've got the main media that we had then. I've reduced them in size somewhat appropriately, I think. We've got the new Min Post. We've got Daily Planet. We've got Car Soup, which I know just did a new deal with the Star Tribune, I think last week. We've got food sites. We've got realty sites. We've got national sites like the Huffington Post. That's a real competitor for readers in this area now. We have the New York Times, which we've talked about already, having regional editions. They're a competitor. Auto Trader, Facebook. Facebook, all those millions of people. The one compelling fact about everything we've talked about this morning, of course, is that unfortunately humans only have the same amount of time that we had in 1997 or in 1950. And so we're splitting it up a lot more ways. So all this competition, you can see this, and I could have added probably 24 more companies to this that are serious competitors for advertisers and for readers. I got to get my clicking right. Okay, there are a lot of numbers here. And there are a lot of numbers in this whole field. We've seen a number this morning. I've picked out some that I think are highly indicative of the change that we are seeing. The first one is a number I came up with. We figured that, that's based on the second number, 10,000 daily newspaper jobs lost over roughly 2.5 years in the United States. That's about 20% of editorial staff at daily newspapers in the U.S. If you do a rough extrapolation off that and assume that newspaper reporters are not really highly productive, and some of them are more productive than others, you end up with 800,000 fewer stories being written nationally in 2009 than were written, say, early 2007. So what were those stories? The problem is we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. Those are the stories that aren't being written. Tom talked about it. You know, there is a lot of journalism not being done. This is the primary problem that we have. Now, another number up here, 85%. So the print industry, for all the reasons, and Jeff, I want you to autograph this paper and put your prediction on here. This is the Monday Pioneer Press, and there are now 80 to 90 newspapers that are daily newspapers that are not daily newspapers. We have all these terminology problems. There are 80 to 90 newspapers in the country that have dropped a day of printing and distribution. But this is the Monday paper. But we have 85% of the revenue that comes into these daily newspaper companies still comes from the print product. Now, if you look at, I do work with Outsell, which is an analytics company in the information industry. That includes education, science, technical, medical, market research, all kinds of publishers. For those publishers widely, 55% of their income is coming from some kind of legacy. And that includes newspapers, which is still the biggest category. 45% meaning largely digital. Newspapers, 15%. They have failed to make that transition. And a biggest number, and I also agree that advertising is going to be the main support going forward, but of this new online pie, only 10% of it's coming from, only 10% of that total online pie, about $24 billion this year in the US, is going to newspaper companies. In the pre-digital world, they got about 20% of the pie. So the fastest growing source of advertising, they're getting half as much of as they got before. Big problem. A few more numbers. Of the top 50 markets, about 14 of them are now led by broadcasters. These are commercial broadcasters who, after waiting a lot longer than newspapers because they didn't have classifieds to get onto the web, are now moving onto the web and being used a lot more by consumers. 7, that's the number of companies that have been newspaper companies in bankruptcy. 57, the median age of newspaper readers in print. Online, it's in the mid-30s. This next number, I think, is a great proxy for this huge change that we have seen. $1.65 billion. That's Google's third quarter, this year, profits. That's how much they took in earnings. If you compare that to Gannett, which is the largest newspaper company in the US, second largest worldwide after News Corp now, which just became, after buying Dow Jones, the largest news company in the world. Gannett itself had revenue of only $1.3 billion, less revenue than Google's profits. And its earnings, and it's a little better in the third quarter than it was even in the first quarter, only $73 million. This is a proxy for power, for clout. Eric Schmidt at Google has said, we're on a buying spree. We're going to be buying companies. They bought AdMob, a mobile advertising company, last week. That kind of marketplace clout is something that gets lost. We can look at the newsroom numbers, very important. We can look at the size of the papers, very important. But these companies, which have had a very strong place in American society, are losing their place and that institutional voice. 4 of 5 top sites on the web for news are aggregators. Only New York Times gets into that kind of ranking. Some newer data points, and this national local question is a very interesting one. So we've done some research at Outsell, and one of the things that we wanted to know, because we do know that the package of information, we all know the package of information that was represented in the daily newspaper has been blown apart. We've talked about that. So we said to people, what's your primary interest in news if you drive them to a primary interest? And 75% of them said national news is our primary interest. 25% said local. I think this is highly indicative and kind of makes sense. Of course, we're all interested in both. But because we can now pick and choose and go to different sites for whether it's business news or sports news or hyper-local news, when we break it down, it's a smaller portion of our lives that we're interested in terms of local. Truly, less happens on a day-to-day basis. And this is part of what daily newspapers and all local media are dealing with, is they have a place in people's lives, but it's a reduced place. 50% are going to Google and scanning headlines and not even going to news sites beyond all of those that are ping-ponging back and forth during the day, meaning us, between Google and news sites. 33% say if they want to find news immediately online, they're going to go on. If they want news immediately, they go online now. That was 25% 2 years ago. makes sense for the reasons that we've talked about, but it is moving as a go-to medium. 25% are using broadcast websites daily. And to this whole paid content question, which has been a huge question in 2009 in the news industry, really only 10% of people say they'd consider paying for news because they understand there are many good enough news sources out there. So is this a death spiral? Is this 3 to 5 years? We can call it that. Tom Corbett, I was talking to him. He's an analyst at Morningstar. He says, don't call it a death spiral. We'd call it a self-perpetuating value destruction cycle. And I thought that was elegant. That's this whole idea of raising prices, and reducing product. So the split that we're seeing between national and local, the way I see it is that there is a group on the left, I call it the Digital Dozen. The Digital Dozen are companies like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, AP, Reuters, BBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, NPR, CNN. You can maybe 12, maybe 14 contenders right there. Because there are 900 million people in the world who speak English well enough to take in news and information, this is a huge opportunity, and they see it. All of these companies are struggling as well. The New York Times just laid off 100 people last week. These companies are struggling. Part of it recession caused, part of it the whole structural change we're seeing, but their opportunity is huge. And again, local, it's a free-for-all right now because reduced market, reduced attention, and we have some players getting smaller very quickly and other ones emerging. Other sense of downsizing, 40% less newsprint than 5 years ago, 20% less staff, little capital to spend, and diminished clout. So, newspapers, which used to be essentially monopolies, or in the case of the Twin Cities, essentially a duopoly, are strategically threatened. They've essentially left their flanks open. If you look at it back to 1997 or many points in the distant past, the barriers to entry were too great for anybody to really succeed. That is no longer the case. So who are the new players? I've categorized them into 7 different kinds of companies. And I probably could have added a couple more here, but I wanted to try to keep it to one slide. So we'll start with, and these are all competitors, importantly, for both readers and advertising, and importantly, they're competitors for our attention. So the ankle biters, you'll notice MinnPost up there, Voice of San Diego, Scott's here, Joel's here, Pegasus News in Dallas. There are many, many kinds of sites. They've started up largely in the last 3 years. These are operations, most of them nonprofit, most of them having between, I'd say, a half dozen and 2 dozen people. They are public-spirited operations. They are the first ones into filling a vacuum perceived in their communities, largely metro area ones. Knight Foundation has been a major funder here. We're seeing that across the country. We're also seeing former journalists in places like Seattle and Denver and others forming new news sites and trying to figure out how to make them work. There are also hyper-local sites, big blogs in certain cities. This is a relatively new category, and the best example of it, this is a picture, if you look at the middle one, that's Politico's website, that's Jim Brady. Jim Brady ran the WashingtonPost.com site for a number of years, one of the more innovative editors in the country online, tried a lot of different things, Washington Post site, quite successful. He left when they did a reorganization because daily newspapers continually like to push their operations together, pull them apart, push them together, pull them apart. And while they're doing that, the world's changing around them. So Jim left when they did the last reorg last year. And now Politico, which is one of those sites along with Huffington Post that has burst into the national ratings, has said they're going to start a site in Washington, D.C. next spring with 50 editorial people, online only. They may do some kind of little print like they do with Politico, but largely online only. 50 there. In San Francisco, Warren Hellman, philanthropist, is talking about hiring dozens of journalists. They presumably will start in spring right now. They're hiring a CEO and an editor as we speak. Chicago, a news cooperative that's feeding the New York Times and may do other things. So now we're getting to a different kind of view of this that you could bring dozens of people to bear, some for-profit, some non-profit. We may see some of the ankle biters, which is a term I got from a newspaper executive when I asked him if he was concerned about these kind of sites, and he said, nah, they're just ankle biters. But the ankle biters could turn into knee choppers. The Watchdogs, investigative reporting, is one of the things that I would imagine most of the people in this room are concerned about. This basic function of watching power, reporting on power. And you need to be smart. You need to have journalistic credibility. You really need the time to do this. Very expensive reporting. Daily newspapers have cut back on it greatly across the country because of the expense. And now what we see is an incredible flowering. And it's almost wholly foundation funded. And we have examples up here like ProPublica. They have done a number of projects, did one with Marketplace over the last month that was pretty interesting on University of Phoenix. Center for Investigative Reporting, run by Robert Rosenthal in Berkeley, former editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, former managing editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and he is just starting a new project every week. And I've talked to him. He cannot believe how quickly this is all taking root. They started a new project called California Watch, which has 13 people. They had 600 applications for those 13 jobs. And they hired people, and they didn't hire people who were bought out or laid off. They hired people who were still employed, largely at daily newspapers, who said, I'm getting out now. I want to go to something that looks more secure. The more secure was foundation funding, which I'm sure a number of you will find ironic in this room, but that's the way the world is going. California Watch produced its first big project on Homeland Security spending and immediately got it placed in 26 daily newspapers in California. And he couldn't believe it. Overnight, they are a legitimate journalistic entity. CBS and Global Post. Global Post, if you haven't checked it out, very interesting international news site, completely independent and does great reporting. They've now tied up with CBS. Then we have this phenomenon, which I think gets short shrift, and we should all be aware of it for good and maybe bad reasons. The pro-am aggregator armies. There's demand media, there's topics, there's Examiner, there's Helium. About.com is really the granddaddy of this, and Outside In down there. Models, fairly similar. So the idea is, guess what? You've got 10,000 daily journalists who have lost their jobs over the last 2.5 years. You have many other people who like to write. Some of them are very good. Some of them are blogging. Some of them are not. We're talking about tens of thousands. We're talking really about hundreds of thousands of people in a country of 300 million people, right? And so these people say, database. You know, like, don't send me an over-the-transom story, our old world, right? Tell me what you do. I put it in the database. I know what topics you can cover. And you're telling me you're willing to write for me. Huge databases of writers have been built by those 6 companies mainly. And then what's going on is they're determining advertiser need. Now, demand media has this down to an absolute science. And so what demand will do is their ad people will say, we've got advertisers for kids' asthma medication. They want to reach that audience. And they'll say, great. According to the algorithm we've produced, we know that we could probably get 200,000 page views against a good story, or say 3 stories on childhood asthma. What they will do, seeing the advertiser need over here and starting there, is go to their database, find their best writers, and they care about quality, their best writers on childhood asthma, commission the story, pay $50, pay $100, now give a revenue share to that writer depending on how well that story does. They are commissioning thousands of stories every week. This mixing and matching is going on. And we don't think of it as news. It's largely featured journalism. But it is health, it's travel, it's sports, it's everything except hard local news, meaning covering government. So it's where the money is. It's a new journalism. Bob Garfield on the media did an interview with the Wired writer who wrote about demand media a couple weeks ago. And it was a great interview. And he stopped for a minute and he said, "This is just fascinating that they've got journalism down to a science." And then he said, "Horrifying." And it's both. But I think we really need to pay attention to how technology changes this and really how some other people see great opportunity here to make a lot of money. And this is money, importantly to me, once a journalist, always a journalist, that will not support journalism. It's going to go into supporting something else. Okay, fine. It's not going to support journalism. So we have to come to grips with this fact. Journalism is manufacturing. And especially old journalism, you could see it in the clanky press, that kind of stuff, even online. It is manufacturing. The question is, and the question before us, is how much or how little value we're going to add to that manufacturing. We always had that question. Some newspapers were better, radio stations, TV stations, better than others, even though it was the same medium, but we didn't pay attention to it that much. And certainly the people working at the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune and MinPost and others, they don't want to think of it that way, but it is. Essentially, this is where it's going. You know the UPC codes that are on all of our products, I stamped them here. I did not ask permission to Sid or Joe or David there. But writers are personalities. Some of their work is much more valuable depending on who they are. We haven't talked about personality a lot, but personality counts, topic counts, timeliness counts. All this stuff counts. Writers as SKUs, stories as SKUs, the science of content. And this is where we're going in terms of pro-am aggregation. One other example here, the city examiners. They claim to be in 180 cities. You can see this is a St. Paul page. This is a Starbucks story from the Seattle Times. Huge number of unique visitors, page views, very good search engine optimization. This company has started just a year and a half ago. They already have 600,000 stories in their database. Sponsorship is their model. And their people are getting $5, $15 a story. Although you can find other sites, the wonder of the internet, where people are saying, hey, those guys are only paying me $1 or $2. What's going on here? So how many? They have 22,000 people now. I just talked to them last week. They'll have 25,000 by the end of the year. And their goal is 35,000 to 40,000 examiners by the end of 2010. They're now doing local. This whole definition of local is very important. And starting next month, they start testing hyperlocal. They're trying to figure out hyperlocal. The writers are being paid per piece. They're getting referral fees if they bring in other examiners. And then now a new program is if they bring in sponsors, they'll get another referral fee. And I said, so they can bring in sponsors on their own content. Do you have a problem with that? And they said, well, we don't think it'll be a problem. Now, this is a fairly big operation. It's owned by Philip Anschutz, who owns the Examiner newspapers. He is a billionaire, lives in Denver, friend of Dean Singleton, by the way. And they just announced a joint advertising selling program in Northern California last week. So I think this is just a wonderful innovation. You've actually combined advertising sales and reporting in one position. I mean, people have looked for that in the news business for a long time. Okay, Metro Public Radio Station. So we see NPR News launched here in June. We're seeing, as you looked at this, I started noticing this and started talking about it, I think, the end of last year. And it's been very interesting to notice what's going on. And this whole question of, what is radio, what is television, what is newspapers, we've talked about this morning. It is funny. Jeff brought up radio people and talking about putting pictures with radio. And it's kind of like, I have to think about that for a while. It's the same thing with CNN, which is what? A TV company. And they're trying to create a wire. And when you talk to people around that operation, they're trying to figure out how text works. How does writing work, right? And so you understand how we all come from these different disciplines, and once we get outside our comfort areas, it's a big problem. Everybody's got the same problem. If you look at print, radio, TV, comfort area, skills, as managers, we can design all kinds of programs, but there's this comfort area, and it's really a question of who gets there first in the right way to combine what is clearly a range of human skills that could be combined in one person. So we're seeing in public radio, it's a very strong audience, obviously. We're seeing the sense of, well, if I go to the website, it doesn't need to be just a programming guide. Some are splitting it, as you have in Minnesota here, between a more of a programming site and a news site. KQED is still figuring that out. There are others trying to figure out how to deal with that question. I hope they don't take too long on that question. And I think this is a very important model. The mission and the question that is now being raised by this session and others as I talk to people is there a primary role as a local news provider for public radio? And of course, this comes out of the cratering of the daily press. It is logical. When I started writing about a year ago, I've said it's just basically logical. If you look at values that are out there in journalism, the ones that are closest to daily newspaper values in many communities are public radio stations. The idea of public service, which shouldn't be that hard a concept. At daily newspapers, that's what we thought we were doing in newsrooms. We always understood we had to make a profit. Those people did it down there on the other floor, but we are part of that same enterprise. In TV, there are mixed values. There is much more value around immediacy and in most radio news as well, and not much on depth or breadth. So this, I think, is a very important development. Lastly, on this one, this question of, okay, you can't just do anything you do in a vacuum anymore. So in San Francisco, the New York Times, I think it's coming up in another couple of slides, New York Times has started a regional edition. They're using their own staff. They have 10 people in the Bay Area who are writing, but they're saying 10 people. They cannot afford to add full-time staff getting paid more than $100,000 a year. So they're talking to KQED. As importantly as public radio stations or any local media, this would apply in this market to MinPost as well, I think, as to an NPR, and same thing would be true across the country. It's not just what you do, but how you connect with other brands, other distribution. This is hugely important. So the KQED San Francisco example with New York Times is one to watch. The NPR project, which we mentioned this morning, 12 stations, the blogger curator role. I know that NPR is moving ahead with something like that with Minnesota Today. And I think things to watch that don't often get talked about are the question of central repository and the idea of networking and tagging of content. National, we have the fact that New York Times, Wall Street Journal are moving there. They're looking for partners for reasons that I've said. And then the searchers. We have the searchers. These are the companies that have most of the money coming into them from online advertising, and they are really trying to figure out how to get at more local advertising themselves. This is Patch from AOL. Many, many projects going on try to figure out how to get at local advertising. Newspapers are retooling. The morning news has taken a little different slant on this. They've increased pricing, as most newspapers have, but they're adding back in the newsroom a little, which makes them unusual. If you cut my Dr. Pepper from 12 ounces to 8 and charge me more, I'll notice. People aren't stupid, said Jim Maroney when I talked to him last week, the publisher of the Morning News. Many, many newspapers have cut prices, have cut content and cut product and slimmed down the newspaper and increased the prices. If you look at some comparison, staff cuts about 20% nationally. Both Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune are significantly above 20% in cuts. So we have Garrison there being above average, representing above average in our slide. I imagine you're all listeners. I don't know. Time on site, Star Tribune is significantly above average at 20 minutes per month. That is above the average of about 12 to 13 minutes for a newspaper site. Pretty good. Revenue declines, we think about average. We don't know all the Pioneer Press numbers. We think about average, which is about 25%, 27% this year for daily newspapers. Bankruptcies, a little bit above average in the market. Level of new news competition is significantly above average because of the ferment we see in this market. We have some numbers here. Accessing the internet, interestingly, of the top 80 markets, this is 9th. Reading daily newspaper, 29th. Visiting radio station, 8th. And so quite above average there, except daily newspaper sites, 51st. These are Scarborough numbers for the industry. And then household income, use of cell phones, number of college graduates, all of these kinds of things. We know the Twin Cities is a very educated, affluent market. And the turn down in circulation, fairly characteristic of the rest of the country. This is household penetration, Star Tribune down about 3 points, and Pioneer Press about 2.5 over the last 2.5 years. Fairly characteristic. Where the money is, about $300 million in online advertising next year in the Twin Cities. And interestingly, about $100 million of that is paid search. So that's money pretty much that does not go to any kind of news company, and the others are all being splintered up among a number of people. How do the sites compare of these? These are numbers from Nielsen. Apples to apples, maybe, maybe not. At least they're all Nielsen numbers. I know the MinPost numbers are quite low compared to MinPost's own numbers on this. I was trying to get a sense over time. I will have this up, and if anybody wants the presentation, you're welcome to look at it as well. But you can see significant lead by Star Tribune over the others, but significant movement, especially of MinPost and NPR. So we know the building blocks here. We know that there's going to be a lot of pro-am content. It's happening all around us. We know that advertising is going to be the big driver of payments. We know that paid content will not be a big driver. We know that technology is going to be key. What we don't know is who's going to be, as we get into 2010, we don't know who the winners and losers are going to be over the next 5 years. But my local takeaways are this. Number one, and most importantly, local news audiences are up for grabs at this point. Yes, there are traditional media that have strong leads in those areas, but these audiences are up for grabs when you look at the unique numbers, the time on site numbers. You talk to each other and see, how we're all accessing news and how we're trying to figure out local. And then you look at this ferment among those 7 categories of local sites I talked about. Farm systems are going to be very important. This whole idea, you got New York Times and KQED I talked about. You have Politico right in the middle of a system. They're partnering with Reuters on the high end, and then they are working with local newspaper sites on the low end. So there are farm systems, there are networks that are absolutely key to make this work for distribution, for brand, and for doing this in an economical way. Content management is absolutely key. Many legacy companies have missed content management and really knowing the value of what they have and the nature of what they have. And then video and mobile are ascendant in these areas. They will continue to grow over the next several years. And really, if you take something like a Facebook, it's the combination of social and video and mobile that has really given it a major push. Lastly, big picture trends, important things to think about. Advertising in and of itself, way apart from local media and everything, is changing dramatically. In fact, one of the numbers that doesn't get out there much, this is a number from some Outsell work that we did, $60 billion a year is now going to companies' own websites. So this is money that's diverted from the advertising economy, but it's all meant to reach customers. The important takeaways, I think, that are both national and local here is that there's been an essential connection between news and advertising for all of our lives. That is now fraying and continues to fray. There's no reason it had to exist. It did. It was nice when it lasted. It's not going to last much longer. So we have a chasm between market content, take the demand model over here, and public service content. I think there's a chasm today. With the science of content that's being brought, think how much this chasm is going to grow. And that leaves us, I think, with the conclusion that some non-market solutions are going to be essential, whether that's foundation money, public money, private money. It doesn't mean the world's only going to go that way, but it's going to be driven in that direction. Last thought, and it's interesting that Tom brought it up this morning. We're our own and each other's editors. This is, I think, when Tom asked the question about how many people send email stories around, it was near unanimous. That in fact is how we are doing editing. No one, I think, predicted that or understood that. We still don't quite understand it, but that's the way that we're making reading choices today. And by chance, that is the #1 law. I have 12 laws in my new books coming out February 2nd, Newsonomics. And that's the first law, so I thank Tom for that.